The dust motes danced in the golden afternoon light slanting through the auction barn's high windows. In the center of the ring stood Jim Holloway, weathered hands hanging loose at his sides, his silver hair catching the light beneath his well-worn Stetson. The crowd held its collective breath as the massive black mare they called Spirit paced the perimeter of the pen, nostrils flared, eyes wild with fear and distrust. She was magnificent, 17 hands of pure power and barely contained fury. Jim took a slow, deliberate step forward. The mare's head snapped up, ears pinned flat against her skull. The tension in the room thickened until you could almost taste it. Someone whispered, "That old fool's gonna get himself killed." But Jim never broke his gaze from the horse. He extended his hand, palm up, and began to hum, a low, gentle tune that seemed to vibrate through the dusty air. Spirit's ears flickered forward, then back, then forward again. Her pacing slowed. Jim took another step, still humming that same soothing melody. Then something miraculous happened. The great black mare stopped, her breathing still rapid but her eyes now fixed on Jim. She stretched her neck forward, nostrils quivering as she caught his scent. Jim remained motionless, hand extended, his weathered face a mask of patience. And then, in a moment that stole the breath from every witness, Spirit took one hesitant step toward him, then another. When her velvety muzzle finally touched his palm, a murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. The untamable mare had chosen trust over fear, and an old rancher with nothing left to lose had somehow made the impossible possible. But to understand how Jim and Spirit found each other, we need to go back to the beginning, when everything seemed lost. Jim Holloway sat at his kitchen table, calloused fingers wrapped around a cold cup of coffee as he stared at the pile of bills before him. The morning light cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor of the ranch house that had been in his family for 4 generations. 6 months since Martha had passed, and the world still felt colorless, empty. Outside, the once thriving Holloway ranch was showing signs of neglect. Fence posts needed mending, the barn roof had sprung a leak, and the cattle herd had dwindled to half its former size. At 68, Jim found himself wondering if it was time to admit defeat. His son Michael's words from their last phone call echoed in his mind. "Dad, you can't keep going like this. Maybe it's time to sell the place, move into town." The thought made Jim's chest tighten. This land wasn't just property, it was the repository of every memory he cherished, every moment with Martha. Selling would be like losing her all over again. That same morning, across the county at the livestock auction grounds, a wild-eyed black mare was being unloaded from a trailer. She had been captured from public lands after a drought forced her herd too close to farmland. The mare fought every step, rearing and striking out at the handlers who cursed and yanked her forward with ropes. "That one's headed for the kill buyers," muttered an auction worker. "Too much fight in her. Nobody's gonna want the trouble." They called her Spirit, not out of respect, but mockery for her refusal to submit. Her coat, once glossy black, was dull and marred with rope burns. But her eyes, those eyes held a fire that spoke of mountains and open skies and a freedom now lost. Jim hadn't planned to attend the auction that day. It was his neighbor, Roy Thompson, who dragged him along. "You need to get out of that house, Jim," Roy had insisted. "Besides, I'm looking at a couple of quarter horses. Could use your eye." Jim had relented, if only to silence the concern he'd grown tired of seeing in everyone's faces. He sat in the bleachers, barely registering the proceedings until they brought in the black mare. Something in her desperate struggle, in the proud arch of her neck despite her fear, caught his attention. He sat up straighter. "That's one of the Mustangs they rounded up last month," Roy explained. "Shame, really. She's a beauty, but too wild. They'll probably send her to slaughter if nobody bids." Jim watched as potential buyers approached the pen, only to back away when the mare lunged at the bars, teeth bared. He saw the auctioneer shake his head, already preparing to move on to the next lot. "She's just scared," Jim murmured, almost to himself. Roy snorted. "She's dangerous is what she is. Not worth the broken bones she'd give you." But Jim couldn't take his eyes off her. In her fear and defiance, he recognized something, a reflection of his own grief and resistance to change, perhaps. Or maybe it was simply that they both seemed to have run out of options. When the bidding opened at a rock-bottom price and no hands went up, Jim found himself on his feet, arm raised. The crowd turned to stare. Roy grabbed his sleeve. "Have you lost your mind, Jim? What are you going to do with a wild Mustang at your age?" Jim didn't have an answer. He just knew he couldn't bear to see that fire extinguished. Later, as he signed the paperwork, the auction manager shook his head. "Your funeral, Holloway. That mare's put 3 handlers in the hospital already. Word spread quickly through the small ranching community. By evening, Jim's phone was ringing off the hook. "Dad, are you trying to get yourself killed?" Michael's voice crackled over the line from Denver. "You can barely keep up with the ranch as it is." Jim's daughter Sarah called next. "Daddy, please be reasonable. You're not a young man anymore." Even Pastor Williams stopped by, concern etched on his face. "Jim, I understand loneliness can drive us to make unusual decisions. But this horse—" Jim cut him off. "I appreciate the concern, Pastor, but I know what I'm doing." The truth was, he had no idea what he was doing. But as he stood at the fence the next morning, watching Spirit pace the corral he'd reinforced for her arrival, he felt something he hadn't felt in months, a sense of purpose. The mare wanted nothing to do with him. She kept to the furthest corner of the corral, eyes never leaving him, muscles tense to flee or fight. Jim simply pulled up a chair and sat, hat tipped low against the morning sun. "Just you and me now," he said quietly. "Might as well get used to each other." For 3 days, this was their routine. Jim would bring fresh water and hay, then sit nearby, sometimes talking softly, sometimes silent. Spirit would watch, never approaching the food until he walked away. On the 4th day, Jim brought an apple. He cut it into pieces, placed one in his palm, and extended his arm through the fence rails. Spirit snorted and backed away. "That's all right," Jim said. "No rush." He left the apple piece on a fence post and retreated to his chair. An hour passed before Spirit cautiously approached, nostrils flaring as she caught the sweet scent. She snatched the apple piece and retreated, but Jim counted it as progress. Roy stopped by that afternoon, leaning against his truck with arms crossed. "How's it going with the death wish on 4 legs?" Jim allowed himself a small smile. "She ate from my hand today." Roy's eyebrows shot up. "From outside the fence, I hope." "Baby steps," Jim replied. Days turned into weeks. Jim established a routine, spending mornings and evenings with Spirit. He'd bring treats, apples, carrots, sometimes just handfuls of sweet grass. He'd talk to her in a low, steady voice, telling her about the ranch, about Martha, about the emptiness that had consumed him since her passing. "Martha would have liked you," he told Spirit one evening as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and pink. "She always did have a soft spot for the stubborn ones. So that's why she married me." Gradually, imperceptibly, things began to change. Spirit still maintained her distance, but her eyes lost some of their wildness. She would come to the fence when Jim appeared, ears forward with interest rather than pinned back in fear. The first time she allowed him to touch her, just the briefest contact of fingers against her velvet muzzle, Jim felt tears spring to his eyes. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable except for that single moment of trust. "Thank you," he whispered, and meant it with his whole heart. That night, he slept better than he had in months. Not everyone shared Jim's optimism. Michael flew in from Denver for a weekend, ostensibly to help with ranch chores, but Jim knew his son was checking up on him. "Dad, I'm worried," Michael said as they mended fence line. "The bank called me. They said you're behind on payments." Jim straightened, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back. "I'll handle it." "How?" "The herd's half what it was when Mom was alive. The equipment needs replacing. And now you're spending all your time with that wild horse instead of running this place." "Spirit," Jim corrected. "Her name is Spirit." Michael threw down his gloves in frustration. "A name doesn't change what she is. She's a distraction you can't afford right now." Perhaps Michael was right. The ranch was sliding further into debt. The cattle needed attention Jim had been diverting to Spirit. But something in him refused to give up on either the ranch or the mare. "I'll figure it out," he insisted. But doubt had crept in. That evening, as Jim brought Spirit her evening hay, he found himself wondering if he was being selfish, holding on to the ranch out of sentiment, taking on a wild horse out of some misguided need for connection. "Maybe we're both just postponing the inevitable," he told Spirit, who watched him with those intelligent eyes. The next morning brought storm clouds and a letter from the bank. Final notice. Jim had 30 days to make good on his payments or foreclosure proceedings would begin. He sat heavily at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd shared thousands of meals with Martha, where they'd made plans and dreams for the future. Now those dreams were slipping through his fingers like sand. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Jim headed to Spirit's corral. The mare was agitated, pacing nervously as thunder rumbled in the distance. Jim approached the fence, speaking in soothing tones. "Easy, girl. Just a storm passing through." A blinding flash of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Spirit reared in terror, then charged the fence. The wood splintered under her weight and momentum. Before Jim could react, she was past him, galloping toward the tree line at the edge of the property. "Spirit!" Jim called after her, but his voice was lost in the downpour. He spent hours searching, driving the ranch roads, calling her name into the storm. By nightfall, soaked and defeated, he returned to the empty house. The silence seemed to mock him. He'd lost Martha, was about to lose the ranch, and now Spirit was gone too. For the first time since Martha's funeral, Jim Holloway wept deep, racking sobs that came from a place of absolute desolation. Morning brought clearing skies, but no relief. Jim moved through his chores mechanically, his mind replaying every mistake, every failure. The broken fence in Spirit's corral stood as a stark reminder of his foolishness. Roy stopped by around noon, concern evident in his weathered face. "Heard your Mustang took off in the storm. Any sign of her?" Jim shook his head. "Maybe it's for the best," Roy suggested gently. "That horse was never going to be tamed, Jim." "She wasn't meant to be tamed," Jim replied, the realization dawning on him even as he spoke. "She was meant to be understood." Something shifted in Jim's chest, a clarity cutting through the fog of despair. He'd been approaching everything wrong. The ranch, Spirit, even his grief for Martha. He'd been fighting against change instead of finding a way to move with it. "I need to find her," he said. Roy sighed. "Jim, I need to find her," Jim repeated, more firmly this time. "Will you help me?" To his surprise, Roy nodded. "I'll call the Peterson boys. They know these hills better than anyone." By mid-afternoon, a small search party had assembled. Jim, Roy, the Peterson brothers with their horses, and even young Tommy Wilson from the feed store. They spread out across the ranch's western boundary, where the property met the foothills. Jim took the creek path, a route he and Martha had ridden countless times. The earth was still soft from the rain, and he spotted hoof prints in several places, but in the rocky terrain, the trail kept disappearing. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the trees, Jim found himself in a small clearing he and Martha had always called their thinking spot. A fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking a view of the valley below. Jim sat, bone-weary and heartsick. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Martha," he said aloud. "Everything's slipping away." A soft nickering sound made him freeze. Slowly, Jim turned his head. At the edge of the clearing stood Spirit, watching him intently. She was mud-splattered but appeared uninjured. Jim's heart hammered in his chest. He knew if he moved too quickly, she would bolt again. But if he did nothing, she might simply turn and disappear into the wilderness forever. Taking a deep breath, Jim made his choice. He turned his body fully towards Spirit but remained seated. Then, softly, he began to hum the same tune his grandfather had taught him decades ago, a melody cowboys had used to calm nervous cattle on night watches. Spirit's ears flicked forward. She took one step into the clearing, then another. Jim continued humming, his eyes never leaving hers. The space between them seemed charged with possibility. When only a few yards separated them, Jim slowly extended his hand, palm up. "It's your choice," he said quietly. "Always has been." For what felt like an eternity, Spirit stood motionless. Then, with deliberate steps, she closed the distance between them. Her muzzle touched his palm, her breath warm against his skin. "That's it," Jim whispered, tears blurring his vision. "That's my girl." With infinite patience, he rose to his feet. Spirit tensed but didn't retreat. Jim reached into his pocket and produced a length of soft rope. He held it up for her to see and smell. "Just to help you find your way home," he explained. "If that's what you want." To his amazement, Spirit allowed him to loop the rope loosely around her neck. Together, they walked back through the woods toward the ranch, Jim never pulling, simply offering direction. The search party was gathered in the yard when they emerged from the tree line. A chorus of disbelieving exclamations greeted them. Roy's mouth hung open in shock. "Well, I'll be damned," he finally managed. Tommy Wilson was practically bouncing with excitement. "Mr. Holloway, that was amazing. How did you do it?" Jim smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. "I just gave her a choice." That night, Jim sat on the porch steps, watching Spirit graze peacefully in the repaired corral. The mare occasionally lifted her head to check his position, as if reassuring herself of his presence. The phone rang inside. It was Michael. "Dad, have you thought more about selling?" "I've been talking to a real estate agent who specializes in ranch properties." Jim watched Spirit in the moonlight. "Actually, son, I've been thinking about diversifying." "What do you mean?" "This ranch has always been cattle, but times change. What would you think about a rescue and rehabilitation center for wild horses? There's good grazing land we're not using, and I've got a feeling Spirit might not be the only one who needs a second chance." There was a long pause. Are you serious? Never more so. I'll need help, of course. Business plans, funding applications. That's more your territory than mine. Another pause, then, I'll fly out next weekend. We can talk about it. 2 months later, Jim stood in the center of the auction ring, facing a crowd of skeptical ranchers, curious townspeople, and potential donors. Behind him, Spirit stood calmly, no halter or lead rope in sight. What you're about to see, Jim addressed the gathering, isn't a trick or a demonstration of dominance. It's what happens when trust replaces fear, when patience replaces force. He turned to Spirit and extended his hand. The mare walked forward and placed her muzzle in his palm. Jim ran his hand up her neck, over her withers, and along her back. Then, with a fluid motion belying his age, he swung himself onto her back. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Spirit stood perfectly still, ears forward, completely at ease with Jim's weight. He leaned forward and whispered something to her, and the mare began to walk a slow circle around the ring. In the front row, Michael and Sarah watched with tears in their eyes. Roy Thompson shook his head in wonder. The Peterson brothers nudged each other in disbelief. Jim guided Spirit with nothing but the lightest touch of his legs and soft words. They moved as one being, the old rancher and the once wild mare, a partnership forged through mutual respect and understanding. When they finished their demonstration, the applause was thunderous. Donations poured in for the Holloway Ranch Horse Rehabilitation Center. The bank agreed to restructure Jim's loans. And word spread throughout the county about the old rancher who had saved an untamable horse and been saved in return. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch, Jim stood at the fence watching Spirit and two newly rescued Mustangs grazing together. You were right, Martha, he said softly to the golden sky. Sometimes the things that seem broken beyond repair are just waiting for someone patient enough to see their value. Spirit lifted her head and nickered softly, as if in agreement. Jim smiled, feeling the weight of loneliness lift from his shoulders like morning mist burning away in the sun. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was she. In the end, it wasn't about taming the untamable. It was about finding the courage to reach across the divide of fear and misunderstanding, to offer a choice instead of a demand, to seek connection instead of control. In that space of mutual vulnerability, both Jim and Spirit had found something they thought lost forever, the chance to begin again.